Reserve. The root of all our evil, it begins with the Federal Reserve. Hey, yeah, well, let's go back in time when everybody was so proud of America.
I'm Tommy Salmons. This is Year Zero, the show that revolutionizes personal engagement in the world and fortification of your life. Let's get to it. We're brought to you by Fox & Sons, foxandsons.com, the best place to get your BBC. I never start my day with anything less than BBC in my mouth, and I suggest if you like BBC, you go to foxandsons.com, get that big bold coffee, and put it in your mouth. foxandsons.com, promo code 0 at checkout for 18% off on any order $25 or more. That's foxandsons.com for that BBC big bold coffee. Put it in your mouth, baby. And the Mark Claire Show. If you enjoyed Mark Claire with Lions of Liberty, you're going to really dig the Mark Claire Show. Mark Claire has gone beyond the realm of politics to dig into the esoteric meaning of life in all sorts of different avenues, whether it be entrepreneurship, ghosts, goblins, Bigfoot, demonic entities, religion. Mark Claire is diving into all of it, and he's not afraid to tackle any task. So go check out the Mark Claire Show. Thank you, as always, Tom Burton, for the music. And you can find this show and many more at the libertarianinstitute.org. That's the libertarianinstitute.org. That's where you'll find me, Patrick McFarlane, Scott Horton, Keith Knight, Will Porter, Kyle Anzalone, and a host of other writers like Kim Robinson. Go to libertarianinstitute.org and keep track of everything that we are doing for you. All right. We're back with Father John Whiteford once again. How are you doing tonight, Father?
Doing good. How about yourself?
I'm hanging in there. That's the best I can do. That's all I can do right now is hang in there.
Yeah.
White knuckling it. So, well, I wanted to talk to you. I wanted to catch up on the Lavra. So, I think it's important at this moment in time, because I've found myself talking to some people, even in the Orthodox Church here in Beaumont, about what's going on with the political strife there in Ukraine. And there's a confusion, and I think it was done intentionally, but there's a confusion between OCU and the UOC. So could you give us a breakdown of who the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is and the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, and kind of where each came from, how long they've been around, and what's been going on with that?
Well, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is a legitimate church of Ukraine that's under Metropolitan Onufry, and was until Constantinople stepped in, and I believe it was 2019 or 2018, maybe at the end of it. Everyone recognized Metropolitan Onufry as the head of the Ukrainian Church, and nobody recognized these schismatic groups that were merged together by Patriarch Bartholomew unilaterally, and contrary to pledges that he had made to the heads of the autocephalous churches. And so the Orthodox Church of Ukraine is the knockoff version, NATO Orthodox fake church that is a merger of two schismatic groups that the bishops are not, with very few exceptions, they're not consecrated by legitimate Orthodox bishops, and there's so many examples that you can cite of these people not even knowing the basics of Orthodoxy. I was looking at a video today of a senior Ukrainian senior priest, so-called, from this church, who was making the sign of the cross, and he wasn't even making it like a cross. He was just going up and down and then up and down again. And so they don't even know the basics of the faith. They have no understanding of orthodoxy. They're open to homosexuality, and basically they're willing to toe the line for whatever the West wants. And people don't actually go to those churches for the most part. But since the last time we talked about this, in the Lavra, they've been systematically tightening the screws. They didn't go in there like gangbusters, but what they've been doing is they've just been gradually closing off one building after another from the legitimate church, and making life harder for the monks. And they're trying to put pressure on them to go over to the fake church. But so far, there's only one monk from the Lavra that's done that. And just, there's a Judas in every group, I suppose. But for the most part, people are holding firm, but they're having fewer and fewer opportunities to actually go to their churches. In many cases now, they're having to have services outside, or they're having services in some rented hall or in somebody's home. And every day you see reports of some new church that's been seized by these people with the help of the Ukrainian government. And so they've just been ratcheting up the persecution step by step, and they're still pushing a law that would actually formally ban the entire Ukrainian, the canonical Ukrainian church, legally from the country.
So they have not passed that law yet. They're still trying to push it through.
Yeah, it's still in the process. I think that they had like the first reading of it, but it hasn't actually been put to a vote. And they're talking about putting it to a vote in the next couple of weeks. And this is over the objections of many Western governments and the United Nations Human Rights Organization. Well, I can't remember their precise name, but there's a number of different groups that have told them that this is a problem. And even the EU has told them that this could be a problem for them becoming members of the EU because it's a violation of religious liberty. But they're so they're so focused on hating this church, with it's a demonic hatred, that they don't seem to care about whether it's going to impact their ability to get into the EU, or whether they're alienating a huge chunk of their population that they might want to then turn around and ask to go fight for the country on the battle line. So it's just really self-defeating. And I think part of what's going on is they are not being very successful on the battlefield, contrary to the way the Western media has been playing it. And so what they can do is go after old ladies and priests and women and children, and beat them up and take their churches away, and maybe that makes them feel good. But these men that are busy stealing churches and beating up old ladies in these churches, maybe those are the guys that ought to be sent up to the front to go fight the war. They seem to be tough guys, and they have a lot of them. Why are they fighting their own people when they could be fighting the war that they're supposedly seen as a life or death struggle?
And on December 29th, saw in your thread on whatever that Telegram, thank you, the OCU activists entered the Church of the Intercession, and the parishioners were actually fighting to stop them from taking the church. And come to find out that the raiders, the OCU, ended up successfully taking the church, but the parishioners were able to make away with some icons. And then there's another one you had posted about them seizing the Kazan temple, and this the icon of the Mother of God. Where did they bulldoze the doors in? Is that what happened?
That just happened I think yesterday or maybe the day before, but they took a bulldozer to open up the church. So basically crashed in the doors with a bulldozer. So probably did significant damage to the church, but they don't care because they probably never have any intention to use that church. Most of these churches, when they get seized by these people, just get padlocked and are not being used because the people are not going to the fake church for services.
Right. And they were having and then we had the UOC where was actually having prayers at the Lavra outside doing vigils.
Yeah, they still, at last I heard at least, they still have access to some churches. So Metropolitan Onufri, every time I see him serving, he's still inside of a church somewhere in the Lavra doing the services. But they are doing services outside too, because the number of churches available to them are fewer and fewer.
Right.
And
So I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, when Metropolitan, supposed Metropolitan Epiphany does a service, they have to bust people in, to try to make the numbers look good. And there were pictures of their new calendar Christmas vigil where there were hardly any people in the church. And that's with them busing people in from out of town. Whereas Metropolitan Onufri doesn't seem to have any problem with people attending his services, and that's despite the fact that the government's breathing down their neck and persecuting people.
You mentioned the new calendar. Would you explain a little bit about the old calendar and the new calendar and what that is? I'm sure my listeners probably aren't real familiar with that.
Yeah, the Russian church has been on the old calendar since it became Orthodox, but the Greek churches switched to the new calendar, with the exception of Mount Athos and the Jerusalem Patriarchate back in the 20s, and Antioch switched like in the 40s. And so Ukraine was on the old calendar. Even the Ukrainian Catholics were on the old calendar, but then this year, or this past year, I should say, they passed a law making new calendar Christmas the official day they would be celebrating Christmas, and changing all the other dates of the liturgical year to adjust it to the new calendar. And the Ukrainian fake church switched to the new calendar on the ostensive ground that they don't want to be like the Russians and be on the old calendar because they're the invaders, and now we're going to be on the new calendar. Well, they're just looking for excuses. Obviously, Patriarch Bartholomew doesn't mind having more churches on the new calendar. And what's funny is Epiphany keeps buying his investments from Russian church suppliers. He doesn't seem to have a problem with that. But for some reason, being on the old calendar is now somehow a problem, even though Ukrainians, that's the only calendar that they've known liturgically.
Now, I had gotten in a conversation with somebody, and they had told me, and I'm not familiar with all the politics behind the church, and it's not extremely interesting to me, if that's fair to say. But they had told me that the way that it worked was that the UOC was under the Patriarchate of Alexandria, but that Patriarchate gave up or leased, I guess, in a way, out the hierarchy to Moscow. Is that verifiable?
No, what it was is when there was the false union of Florence, that was when the Russian church declared itself autocephalous because they denounced that union as being heretical. And so eventually, after the Turks took over Constantinople and you had Orthodox bishops again in charge in Constantinople, they recognized Moscow as being autocephalous, and actually fifth in the diptychs, and the Patriarch of Moscow being a patriarch. But at that particular time, there were parts of Ukraine that were still under Turkish control or under Polish control. And so those parts remained under the ecumenical patriarch. Well, eventually the Russian Empire recaptured these areas, and there was a lot of back and forth, but there was a letter from the patriarch that basically ceded the control of that area to the Russian church forever. And I have a blog article talking about the historical questions on this. What Constantinople has latched onto is there was some kind of a document early on where they were saying that the Metropolitan of Kiev had to commemorate the Patriarch of Constantinople, even though they were under Moscow. And whether that even happened for a short period of time, I'm not really sure, but it certainly didn't continue. But they nevertheless ceded control of that area to the Russian church. So it's either under Russian control or it's not. Well, the Patriarch of Constantinople at the time said that it was. And 300 years pass, and never does Constantinople raise any objection and say, hey, you're not abiding by that stipulation that you had to commemorate me in Kiev. And it's only, after the United States puts the screws to Constantinople to recognize a schismatic group in Ukraine to try to undermine Russian influence in Ukraine, that suddenly this becomes an issue. Well, it's totally bogus. And if that was an issue, it would have been an issue 100 years ago, and it wasn't. And the thing is, even if you accepted the arguments that somehow that this part of Ukraine that was at that time still under Constantinople somehow was under Constantinople, or that they still had some claim to be made, that wasn't all of Ukraine. That was like a slice of Ukraine. Most of what's in the eastern and southern part of Ukraine was already under Russian control. So it's a bogus argument, but it's an argument that they're making to try to provide some fig leaf for their blatant violation of the canons and intrusion into the canonical territory of another local church, which, we have canons for a reason, because they provide order in the church. And one of the most basic canons is that one bishop can't just go into another bishop's territory and set up shop. Once you allow that to happen, then that means there's no order in the church, and you're just going to have squabbling and fighting all over the place. And that's one of the reasons why most of the local churches have not recognized Ukraine, because even if they might not be so happy about everything the Russian church has been up to, a lot of these local churches know that if they allow the precedent that the Patriarch of Constantinople can just willy-nilly revoke agreements that they make to recognize a local church's autocephaly, that means they don't really have autocephaly.
Yeah.
Because autocephaly means self-rule. And if you have self-rule, but at any moment the person that gave you self-rule can revoke it and then resume telling you what to do, that means you don't really have self-rule. That means you've got this sword hanging over your head by the thread, by the tiny thread that could be cut at any moment. And so that's why other local churches have wisely said, no, we're not going along with this.
I throughout this entire thing, I hear remnants of the past, just kind of echoes of the past. So what I see the OCU and the way that you describe it and the way that they're acting, I remember you had posted a video a few months back. I mean, it's probably 6-7 months ago, when these guys were like dancing through the church and just doing wild stuff. And it was just so disrespectful watching them. And then there was another one with a deacon got in a fight with one of the OCU priests. And I'm hearing echoes of like the living Soviet church under the Bolsheviks. And then with the whole Constantinople thing, even with the OCU showing up to the Lavra with these forged documents, then there's like this echo of the forgeries of the schism of 1054. And it's just so odd to see the history just replay itself.
Right. And for people who aren't familiar with it, back in the 1920s, the Soviets set up what was known as the Living Church because they were trying to undermine the legitimate church in Russia. And there were liberal clergy who had been in the Russian church that went along with this. And they thought maybe that if they did what the Soviets were doing, were wanting them to do, that somehow they would be exempt from being persecuted. And this church was actually recognized by Constantinople at the time. And they were also recognized by Alexandria. And they remained in communion with this fake church up until about World War II. So they were basically stabbing the Russian church in the back while it was being crucified by the Soviets, and even condemning Patriarch Tikhon, who was later, most people believe, murdered by the Soviets. And what happened in the Russia, though, was most of the people never recognized the Living Church. So eventually the Soviets got tired of playing along with the Living Church because they realized it wasn't getting any traction. And finally, the last bishop of the Living Church died off like in 1946, and that was when the Living Church died, no pun intended. And then Constantinople just kind of forgot that they had recognized that as the legitimate church and moved on and acted like it had always supported the canonical church in Russia. And so it's an exact repeat. And you also, the way the Soviets did churches back then was they often converted them into things like dance halls and stuff like that. So you had dancing in churches, concerts, other kinds of desecrations of churches, and that's exactly what you're seeing in Ukraine right now. I mean, there's concerts in the Kiev-Lavra churches right now that are being held thanks to the Zelensky regime in churches.
And I mean, you made a point earlier, and I think it's a valid point that can't be overstated, is that if Ukraine was, I'm not saying that there's not a war going on by any stretch of the imagination, but it seems very contained into certain regions, in the Donetsk region, in Crimea, and over in the eastern regions. How is it that these people can have so much free time to go around and persecute Christians and have concerts when they're at war?
Well, it's because you basically have Western Ukrainians, many of whom are happy to let Russian-speaking people from Eastern and Southern Ukraine be drafted and sent into the meat grinder, because they're basically killing two birds with one stone. They're getting rid of their own Russian-speaking population. In the process, they're at least killing some of the Russians that are in the Russian army. So it's a win-win for them if you're looking at it from that evil perspective. Whereas these people are busy doing crap like this in the in the areas that are not in the direct combat zones. And guys, a lot of these guys are more than happy to do that rather than be sent to the meat grinder. The same thing with these guys that are rounding up people for the draft. They're happy to be doing that because they want to send people to the meat grinder, not be sent themselves to the meat grinder.
Right. It's like a coward's way out. They're still
Right.
doing the will of the state, but they're doing that will in a much safer place.
Right. And they're disproportionately drafting Russian-speaking Ukrainians, but they're also doing it to thank people who are other minority groups, like the Rusyn population, also the Romanians, the Hungarians, anybody that's not the people that they really want to be controlling Ukraine when all things are said and done. They're more than happy to send them off to get killed.
And all right, so there are the mainstream media is finally coming around to admitting once again that there are actual Nazis within Ukraine that are acting that the government is basically acting on behalf of. How are these factions getting along on the front lines whenever there's so much strife? And I mean, there's been a civil war in Ukraine for since 2014. And
Right.
so how is this operating?
Well, typically, what Ukraine seems to be doing is they have blocking units that are behind the lines of the frontline troops, and those people tend to be the ideological neo-Nazi types. I should say paleo-Nazis because there's nothing neo about it. They're just Nazis. And so those people are there to shoot people if they're retreating or to fire upon people who are trying to surrender. So they're there, but they're not always in the same units, because they don't want to die. So they're at a safe enough distance to let other people die and to make sure that they can keep those people in the fight, but they're not in the front lines themselves usually. Now, in some cases they have been, like in Mariupol, you had the Azov folks doing a lot of that fighting there, and there's some other places where that's happened. But for the most part, in the battles that we've seen the last year, it's been mostly cannon fodder versus the Russian army. And the cannon fodder people are mostly people who don't really want to be there.
It would just seem to me that it would be, I don't know, and maybe I'm just speaking out of bias here. It would seem to me that what would be happening would be that the Ukrainians would be sending faithful parishioners of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church to the front lines to die in order for the OCU to catch a foothold. Is that accurate? Is that happening?
Well, I mean, they're sending them to the front lines. I'm not sure if they're identifying them strictly because of their church affiliation, or if they're just going after Russian speakers who tend to be members of the legitimate church. But they're doing it nonetheless. And there are, I should say, many people who are part of the legitimate church that signed up to go fight because they felt like it was their patriotic duty, and they really did resent what Russia was doing. So I don't want to act like it's, that there's nothing in between the Azov battalion and the people who don't want to fight. But I've seen more and more videos from people who are part of the legitimate church that are basically saying, hey, I'm on the front lines fighting for Ukraine, and you're back there closing my churches and persecuting my people. Why should I keep fighting for you?
Yeah.
And so I think it's really totally self-defeating. If you're looking at it from a purely utilitarian perspective, you would think that Zelensky would say, hey, we're all united against these evil invaders, and not try to divide people. But that's not what they've been doing. And it's because they have these really hard ideological lunatics that are more concerned about ideological and racial purity than they are about actually doing something that would be effective.
What does this, would you call it a mini schism? What would this mean? What does this mean for the rest of the church?
It depends on where it all stops, but I mean, it could ultimately mean that we wind up with a permanent split of some sort. And there are other things that are going on parallel to this that are not totally unconnected. For example, Patriarch Bartholomew has called for a pan-Orthodox council of some sort to celebrate the 1700th anniversary of Nicaea, and has invited the Roman Catholics to participate. and the Pope has already accepted the invitation, a lot of people, myself included, think that that's when they're likely to announce some sort of a union. It might not be that they're going to say, well, we've just merged. What I think more likely what they're going to say is, well, now we can have sacraments together. And they'll try to act like Constantinople really hasn't changed. It's still this independent Orthodox local church, but now they're just able to take communion with Roman Catholics. But in fact, they're just going to become another uniate church. And there also is the promotion of homosexuality that you see in the ecumenical patriarchate, particularly in the person of Archbishop Elpidophoros. And that's not unconnected with what you're seeing going on in the Roman Catholic Church right now, where they're blessing, gay couples and pushing the margins there. So, Elpidophoros hasn't proposed blessing gay couples yet, but I won't be surprised if they start talking about doing something similar.
We did have a scandal last year in which there was a bishop that or priest or a bishop that had baptized children adopted by a gay couple. Am I correct about that?
Yeah, that was Archbishop Elpidophoros. He did this in Athens, so he had to ask permission from the local Archbishop of Athens to use a church there for this purpose, and he didn't tell them what was going to actually happen. So the church of Greece was very and justifiably upset about it. And as a matter of fact, Mount Athos has refused to allow Elpidophoros to go to Mount Athos as a result of what he did. Now, a lot of people defend what he did, and they'll say, well, look, those babies are not guilty. But he didn't just baptize those babies. He baptized those babies for two gay men that were legally married and obviously have no intention of raising those those children in the church in a way that isn't consistent with what the church actually believes. They're going to be modeling a perverse lifestyle in front of these children and filling their minds with garbage about that. And on top of all that, those two babies were born from surrogate mothers, and basically, this is a thing. And Ukraine is kind of one of the hubs of this, as a matter of fact, where you've got these wealthy gay men in the West that are renting the wombs of these poor women in countries like Ukraine and having babies from them. And of course, this also involves creating embryos that often wind up being destroyed. And the church has condemned surrogate mothers because you're basically confusing who's the parent of a child in a case like this. Is just not a healthy Christian way for children to be produced, and particularly when you're just producing them so a gay couple can go around and say, hey, look, we got a baby. And I used to be a supervisor with the state of Texas, and I had a guy that I was supervising who was homosexual, and he and his boyfriend had adopted a child when they were living out in California. And he was a nice guy, and over the years we were talking. I'd show him pictures of my kids. He'd show me a picture of his kids from time to time. But when that kid got to be in his teens, he would come into my office and start talking about how his kid was really troubled, and he kept trying to burn the house down. Well, why would a kid want to burn their own house down? They might want to burn their own house down if their house was a hellhole that they didn't want to be in. And that boy was obviously not growing up as a healthy, well-adjusted child, because he had two gay men who were raising him as if they were both his fathers, and it was very confusing to him. And so those gay adoptions and the use of surrogate mothers and stuff like that, it just doesn't end well. But of course, you can't actually do legitimate research on the subject, because the University of Texas did research on that topic and showed that it wasn't healthy. And then the people who did that got destroyed because they came to the wrong conclusions. So science and truth doesn't matter in this Orwellian world that these radicals are trying to create.
Well, if you don't mind, I want to shift over to Israel because I think this all ties in, at least on a spiritual level, the way what we're seeing going on just around the world in general, and the way it's affecting everybody. It affects all of us, and I think very deeply affects all of us. So, in Israel, Israel and Gaza obviously, well, Hamas carried out a horrendous attack on Israel, and there were a lot of innocent victims to this attack. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I don't think anybody would question that. Um, but since then, there have been reports of Israel bombing hospitals and specifically churches, and specifically a church that was 1,600 years old. And I remember I can never. Justin Amash said that he had family that was in that church, and some of his family members died in that bombing of that church.
Right. One thing I would refer people to is Max Blumenthal.
That was a horrible question. I'm sorry, I didn't finish my question. I kind of got choked up there. I apologize.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No. You go ahead with what you're saying.
Well, Max Blumenthal and Aaron Mate of the Gray Zone have been doing a lot of good reporting on what happened. And one of the things they pointed out is I'm sure that Hamas did kill innocent people on October the 7th, but there are a lot of the people who were killed on October the 7th that were actually killed by the Israelis, because we have footage of from the night vision cameras of Apache helicopters where the Israelis were just going after the people, like at that concert, and just killing, blowing up cars indiscriminately because they knew there were Hamas people in there. And the Israelis figure it's better to kill the hostage and the hostage takers than to allow a hostage to be taken and then have that hostage used against Israel later on. And a lot of the houses that were destroyed by weapons that Hamas was not even using, because they don't have those kinds of weapons. So those houses were destroyed by Israeli tanks. And of course, there's a lot of fake reporting that the Israelis have engaged in because they're trying to come up with some way to justify what they've been doing, which is not to say, again, that there were not innocent people killed. And in any kind of a war, I'm sure that there are things like rapes and other kinds of atrocities that do take place, because when you give people guns and put them in a position where they have absolute power over innocent people and they think nobody's looking, there's bad things that often are going to happen. But the death toll is probably not all of October the 7th is not all Hamas is doing. They wanted to take hostages because the Israelis have been throwing Palestinians into jail and holding them indefinitely, and they wanted to have some leverage to make Israel let those people go.
Mm.
And so then Israel decided to go on this genocidal rampage where they've just been leveling systematically all the buildings in the city of Gaza, which was one of the most densely populated cities in the world. And but in addition to destroying things like high-rise residential buildings, they've been destroying hospitals, and clearly they have precision-guided weapons, just like the United States does, because that's where they get most of their weapons from. And they've been destroying churches and mosques. They destroyed some mosques that were very historic buildings too. In many cases, they had been churches at one time, but they've been mosques for a long time. And they're historic buildings. Some of these actually even go back to the time of the Philistines, and they were pagan temples, if you go back far enough. So these are very, to destroy history unnecessarily like this is just a crime against humanity. not to mention what they're doing to the people. And their obvious intent is to try to drive all the Palestinians out of Gaza. And then they will probably do the same thing they did with the Golan Heights, which is they'll say, well, we can never let this go back into the hands of the original inhabitants because we had to pay such a high price to capture this land in the first place. So we're going to annex it into Israel. And that seems to be what their intention is. And any other country on the planet that did this would be condemned roundly by the world. And most countries are condemning what they're doing. But unfortunately, the United States and a lot of the big players in Western Europe are not condemning it, and they're giving them cover. And it's just absolutely horrendous.
Right. Well, the reason I really wanted to touch on this is there's a term that floats around here in the West, and I'm sure you being a former Protestant, you dealt with this, is Judeo-Christian. So can you kind of give us kind of a breakdown of what this Judeo-Christian is, what the outlook is, where it came from, where this idea came from?
Well, it's a phrase that people coined because they were trying to say, well, we have this religious tradition in America that really crosses the lines between Christians and Jews. We have this basic morality that we hold in common. And, back when America was not as diverse as it is now, and Jews were one of the only minorities that were not Christians of some sort. You could kind of see why they would come up with a phrase like that to try to say, hey, we're all on the same page morally, even if it's questionable that that's really true. But at least on some level, you could say, yeah, we all agree that murder is wrong and stuff like that. The other thing that we have going on in the United States, though, is that since the late 1800s, we've had Christian Zionism really start to take hold. And so you have a lot of Protestants like John Hagee that somehow think that evangelicals are supposed to support Israel no matter what they do. And my daughter's she's the co-chair of the National Young Republicans, and they were at some kind of an event, and there was a resolution that was about what was going on in Gaza, and they were wanting to express unequivocal support for Israel. And my son-in-law, who is a veteran and was in Afghanistan and in Iraq, raised his hand. He said, I'd like to make a motion that we strike the word unequivocal. Because if you say unequivocal, that means that it doesn't matter what Israel does, we're going to support them. And I don't think we should say that. And so there was a lot of back and forth. And he said, I think I'm probably the only one in this room that's ever actually fought jihadists that were actually using human shields. But when we were in Afghanistan and the jihadists would shoot at us from a school with kids in it, you know what we wouldn't do? We wouldn't just blow up the school. That was a line that the American military wouldn't cross. Now, obviously, you do have collateral damage, and our United States track record of avoiding civilian casualties is not great, but at least they try to make at least a pretense of avoiding civilian casualties, whereas Israel openly said, we're not worried about it. The head of their military said, we're focused on damage, not precision. Well, when you're bombing a densely populated city and you're saying you're not worried about precision, you're just worried about damage, that means you don't care how many people you kill. That's what you're saying. And they basically made it clear that their goal is to depopulate Gaza. And they want the Palestinians to go into the Sinai Desert, and then they just won't let them back. That's what their plan is, and it's an absolute atrocity. The United States shouldn't do this, and anybody who calls himself any kind of a Christian should not support this, because the idea that we should support Israel no matter what they do is inconsistent with the Bible. God never supported Israel no matter what they did. When they did things that were wrong, God was more than happy to pull the rug out from underneath them and cause them to be defeated. As a matter of fact, they got kicked out of the land twice because they didn't do what God wanted them to do. So, so why should we support Israel? And besides that, it's a false equation to even talk about the modern state of Israel as if it's the Israel in the Bible to begin with. It's just not. We're dealing with a secular government, a government that when I visited there, I think it was like in 2014, they had gay pride flags up and down, the street because it was June. And, they have gay pride parades, and Israel claims to have one of the highest densely the biggest populations of LGBTQ people. So by any biblical standard, we're not talking about, the Israel of the Bible that would deserve any kind of unequivocal support from Christians.
Well, when we talk about the Israel of the Bible, my understanding is, and you feel free to correct me, I'm just a layman here. My understanding is that Israel is a term reserved for the people of God, and that the church is the new Israel.
That's exactly right. And if you look at what St. Paul says in Romans, he talks about the olive tree as an image of the church, which goes back to the Old Testament. And he talks about the Jews that rejected Christ as being severed branches, and the Gentiles that were embracing Christ as wild olive branches that are being grafted onto the tree. And what St. Paul doesn't talk about is there being two olive trees. There's not the Jewish olive tree and then the Gentile Christian olive tree, which is what John Hagee would want you to believe. But St. Paul and John Hagee were not on the same page.
So when we hear the term, because this is something we hear thrown around a lot, is replacement theology is not of the Bible, is not spoken of in the Bible. That I've seen that said so many times on Twitter. I've heard people say it, that replacement theology is not biblical. How would you respond to that?
Well, it's not replacement like the Church of the Old Testament got wiped off the stage, and then all of a sudden some new thing took its place.
Is that what they're
trying? The Church of the
trying?
New Testament is the continuation of the Old Testament church. It's just that the Church of the New Testament consists of those that embrace Christ and are part of the church, and the Jews that rejected Christ have cut themselves off from that church. So they're the ones that broke themselves off from that tree.
Right. So whenever people use the term replacement theology, because like if you say like, okay, if I were to say to a Protestant what I said to you a while ago, from my understanding, the church is the new Israel. They would shoot back immediately with, well, that's replacement theology. That's not biblical.
Right. And what I would explain to them what I just said, and I would just say, you're following a view of the Bible that nobody believed who was either a Christian or a Jew prior to about 1829. That John Darby was the one that started all this. He was an English Baptist preacher, and eventually it made its way into the United States, and it only really caught on, like I said, in the late 1800s, thanks largely to the Scofield Study Bible. And then it really caught on even more so after World War I, because prior to that, most Protestants had this view that basically things were going to just get better and better until the kingdom of God was established on earth. So they saw church history as being one of progress. And then when World War I happened, they saw things not going the way that a lot of people had thought that they were going to go. And so this idea of appealing to an apocalyptic view had an appeal, but it was mixed in with this Zionistic view that somehow God had two tracks of salvation, and that somehow Christians had some obligation to support a secular Jewish state, and to help them take over and kick Christians off the land. And And they'll often quote what God's promise to Abraham: "I'll bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you." Well, read what St. Paul says about who the seed of Abraham are. The seed of Abraham are Christians.
Mm.
And so the Palestinian Christians, the Zionistic Christians, have supported being displaced from their land, are the ones that God is going to curse those that curse. And you're cursing the seed of Abraham if you're cursing the Christians who are the Palestinian Christians, and you're allowing them to be displaced.
This is more for me here, this question. So if everybody wants to check out on this one, I'm okay with that. Whenever St. Paul says there's neither Jew nor Gentile, right? And he's talking about in the body of God, like in the body of Christ, there's neither Jew nor Gentile. How are we supposed to engage with that in this secular society that we live in? Like, because like my reading of it is like, don't discriminate based upon nationality or heritage or color of skin or any of these weird, isms that people like to throw out there. But at the same time, you have to have some kind of like discernment when having these conversations with people. It's like God's not going to reject anybody based upon these facets of their life and these things that they cannot control about themselves. But at the same time, if somebody is like, let's say a rabbinic Jew or Zionist, like how do you interact with this?
Well, when St. Paul said that, he also said there's neither male nor female, but we don't believe that there's no longer men and women in the church. What he meant by that is that there's a certain sense in which everybody in the church is on an equal footing. We all stand before Christ, and we all have a relationship with him and are saved in the same way. But you could still be a Jew who embraces Christ, enters the church, becomes a Christian, and still be a Jew in an ethnic sense. So no one's required to reject their culture or their ethnicity when they come into the church, but it definitely does mean that there's no privileged position for Jews, or for that matter for Gentiles. We're all the same. And when it comes to, for example, offices in the church or other sacraments that are in the church, there's no ethnic distinctions that are made in terms of who is eligible for those things. If somebody's eligible to be a priest by standards that have nothing to do with ethnicity, then they can be ordained. And if they're not eligible, then they are not supposed to be ordained, and it has nothing to do with ethnicity. You can receive any sacrament of the church as long as you meet the requirements to be able to receive that sacrament, and ethnicity never has anything to do with it.
Right. Okay. It's been on my mind lately, just thinking, and I was just like, might as well ask while we're here. So,
yeah.
How do you see this going? Because I kind of feel like, I think I heard Father Stephen DeYoung make a point one time that the reason that we have like rules of engagement in war is due to Christianity, right? And due to the Christian influence over societies, especially Western societies, and with the United States becoming the world's sole superpower for so long, that they were able to kind of hold these rules and hold people accountable to these rules. But it seems like now that we're entering this like multipolar world, with like China growing more influential, Russia becoming more influential, more of a superpower, and more back to its superpower status that of like, let's say like the 70s, and or even prior to World War II, I'd say. That we're kind of watching Israel kind of roll back those rules of engagement. and bring back more of that barbaric kind of sense of war where it's just total utter destruction. And I remember hearing think it was Jocko Willink said the reason that we could never that Afghanistan and Iraq were a lost cause is because America didn't have the stomach to do what it would take to actually win those wars. And I'm wondering, are we watching for the first time in our lifetimes a country that does have that stomach? Is that what we're actually witnessing?
Well, I mean, I think there's probably some truth to that. I mean, as far as like the origins of rules of engagement, I do think that that's largely based on Christian principles. Although Muslims have some rules of engagement in terms of what they'll do with prisoners, but I don't know that they always have abided by them very well.
Right.
But one of the things about having rules of war is that if you want to have peace and reconciliation when the war is over without just wiping out the defeated party, if you actually abided by some rules, and for example, if you fought according to the old rules, and those rules included things like, I'm not going to kill your women and children because we're men and we're at war, so it's fair game for us to try to kill each other. But if I'm in a position where I could kill your wife and your kids, you know what? I'm not going to do it. And when you defeat an enemy, or if you get defeated by your enemy, but you saw that your opponent actually abided by those rules, that's actually a ground for reconciling when the war is over, because you could say, you know what, you fought honorably, and you either won or you lost, but you fought honorably. But that's not what's going on now, and that's the reason why Israel is not ever going to get peace as long as they have Palestinians still around. And the thing is, even if they are successful in driving all the Palestinians out, they still got to deal with the fact that they've got millions of Muslims surrounding them that are not going to be happy with what they're doing. And quite honestly, I wonder if they're not intentionally trying to spark World War III with what they're doing, because they seem to be going out of their way to antagonize Muslims. I mean, for example, when they blew up that historic mosque in Gaza, they had to know that the Muslim world was going to see that. And when they have done things like mocked Palestinians' homes and done Jewish dances inside of mosques and stuff like that, they have to know that that footage goes out to the Muslim world. And just recently, they assassinated some, high-ranking member of Hezbollah, and they assassinated some Iranian guy. It's almost like they want Iran and Hezbollah to get into this, and they're just counting on the fact that the United States is going to step in there and have their back. And the thing is, I'm not sure the United States, even if they do throw their weight in there, is going to be able to save their bacon in that war, because our military is in a shambles right now. We've sent quite a bit of our weaponry and ammunition to Ukraine, and we have shortages of weaponry right now. Not to mention the fact that our military is in a very bad condition. So if we actually wind up in a war with Iran and Hezbollah, and maybe, let's say, Jordan and Egypt wind up getting thrown into the whole mix, I don't know if the United States can successfully save Israel, from being destroyed.
That's one thing. I published my podcast at the Libertarian Institute, and one of my good friends is the director of the institute, Scott Horton, who does a Scott Horton show, and it's all anti-war stuff. He's an editor for antiwar.com. And one of the things he said several times is, like, the one thing, like, they've done generated all these war efforts via computer and AI and stuff, and just to see what happens if we entered into a ground war in Iran, and it never goes well for the United States. And the same thing with a war with China. It just doesn't go well for the United States. And my heart goes out to all the innocent people that are involved in this. I have a actually kind of a softer spot for Lebanon, and I worry about what's going to happen with Lebanon because I go to Antiochian church, and a lot of the congregation that my godfather included are Lebanese, and
Right.
my priest's wife is from Lebanon. He met her when he was going to seminary in Lebanon, and he's Chilean. They're talking about moving back to Lebanon in the next few years, and so I really I find myself concerned with that portion of how this war is going to continue to be conducted if Israel keeps pushing the limits, as you're saying. How long before people really other groups start getting involved? And I know there have been I know the Houthis have attempted to fire rockets at Israel, and the U.S. has intercepted them, and from their the ships they have put out there. But
Yeah,
if
but the thing is the missiles that we're using to take out those Houthi missiles are like $1 million a piece, and the Houthi missiles are like maybe $1,000 a
right,
piece,
yeah,
and they've
yeah,
got a lot more of those missiles than we do of the ones that we need to take them out. Plus, the one thing the war in Ukraine has shown is that the state of technology has made a lot of things obsolete. And if you look at our Navy, if you separate out the submarine service, which is still, from what I understand, probably the best in the world, although Russia's pretty close. We have a Navy that's built around aircraft carriers. Well, aircraft carriers are just big floating targets. That's the reason probably why uh, the USS Ford battle group went back to North America rather than sit out there, because um, in today's warfare, those ships are going to just be taken out. And unfortunately, because uh, we've done so many stupid things with our military, those aircraft carriers have nicknames of like the Love Boat, because they've got maternity wards on those aircraft carriers, because you put men and women together, and surprise, surprise, you put 18 to 25-year-old men and women in close proximity and set them out to sea for a year.
yep.
You start having babies popping up. Well, now we've got maternity wards on our battleships. And what kind of a commander would go into a war with a maternity ward on their ship? Not to mention the fact that these things are just obsolete. They're relics of a bygone era. They work great if you're fighting countries that don't have a real military,
Mm.
but they don't work good against a country that's got missiles. And Iran certainly does. Hezbollah has missiles, and the Houthis even have missiles. And we just are totally unprepared for what will happen. But unfortunately, it seems like our own government wants World War III too, and I think that the fact that we're heading into where we're in and now an election year, it might not be coincidental that
Yeah.
that they're pushing for World War III as we enter into this election year. Because when you get into World War III, you can then start invoking war powers and doing emergency kinds of measures that could alter the calculations of a normal election year. So it's all really scary stuff, but I just don't see how we possibly come out ahead if we get into any of the wars that these crazy people we have running our country, and actually it crosses party lines, seem to be wanting to get us into. Well, I don't think we could beat Russia in a war right now with the military we have. We could certainly do them a lot of damage, but I don't think we could defeat them. We certainly can't defeat China. So, and if it got into a even if it was just us, our Navy fighting China and trying to ostensibly protect Taiwan would wind up being leveled. And China has missiles that could take out our Navy very easily. Any surface ship that we have within a certain 100-mile radius of China would be blown to smithereens. And China's a lot closer to Taiwan than the United States is. So you just there's no way we come out ahead in any of these wars that we're trying to push. And even in the Middle East is not what it was back in 1990. we cannot just ride roughshod over these countries. And we might have been able to invade Iran back in 1990, although I'm not sure that would have gone very well for us, not unless we were willing to pay a very high price to win that war. But Iran is not what it was in 1990. It's far more technologically advanced. They developed the drones, many of the drones at least, that Russia has been using in Ukraine, and which means that they could easily use those against us or against Israel. Plus, they have very highly developed missiles that are more than capable of devastating Israel from one part of it to the next if they have to do it. So it's just nuts. And Israel's already said that they're more than happy to start using nuclear weapons if their existence is threatened. So do we really want to see what will happen and who's gonna lose in a game of nuclear chicken? I don't. I would rather not see that happen.
Mm. One of the things I think about quite often here recently too, and after this we can get off here because it's been over an hour, or right at an hour. The United States has been involved in almost every hot war since the 80s in one way, shape, or form, whether arming the conflicts or actually sending men and women in to die. The fact that the nation is so gung-ho on war, what does that do to the soul of the people of that nation and the nation on whole?
It's not good, but I would say I don't think most Americans are all that gung-ho for war like they used to be. I think, particularly seeing how the whole war on terror has just ended in a debacle, and many people, sacrificed their health, saw their friends blown up, and gave their lives to the military to fight in wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, only to see it all go up in a puff of smoke, and those countries be worse off as a result. I don't think people really want to keep going down that road like they used to. There's still a lot of people in the mainstream parts of both parties that want to keep going down that road because it's very lucrative. There's a lot of people who get rich when we keep spending $1 trillion on our defense industry every year. But I don't think most of the American people want to keep going down that road. And one other thing I've been meaning to mention, but I keep forgetting when I have the opportunity, is how in the war in Ukraine, the United States has not only been arming the Ukrainians, but we've been giving them real-time satellite intel on what the Russians are doing. Do you think for a moment that if we get into a war in the Middle East, that Russia is not going to return the favor? Hezbollah doesn't have any satellites that I know of. Iran probably has some, but they don't have the kind of technology that Russia has. I guarantee you, if we get into a war with those folks, the Russian government is going to be feeding them real-time intel, and they're going to be supplying them with weapons, and the United States is going to get to see what it's like when they're on the receiving end of that kind of stuff. And the shame of it is back during the Cold War, both countries had enough sense to know that there are certain lines we don't want to cross because we both are armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons, and we don't want to get to the point where one side or the other feels like it might make sense to start using those weapons. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States essentially came to believe that it could do whatever it wanted to do and get away with it. Well, we need to come to the conclusion that we're no longer in that world, that we can't just keep doing what we want to do and expect that we're going to get away with it. Because I think that the bill is coming due, and it's gonna really hurt when we have to pay that bill.
I wonder what if this continues to escalate. I wonder what that would mean for Azerbaijan and Armenia. That conflict's been going on for a while too. And
it's hard to say, but unfortunately, the United States has tried to talk Armenia into thinking that somehow they might be better off if they ally themselves with the United States rather than with Russia. And I hope that they wake up, because I think it was Henry Kissinger that once said that to be an enemy of the United States is dangerous, but to be a friend of the United States is fatal. And I think he was saying that as a bitter comment on what happened to Vietnam and how our government wound up throwing South Vietnam under the bus.
Yeah.
But it's been proven true over and over again. And so you're far better off to not be on good terms with the United States than you are to count on the United States to be there for you. Because, like, Biden has assured Ukraine, we'll be with you every step of the way. We'll give you whatever you need. We'll be there no matter what it takes. But it's already becoming pretty clear, particularly since this thing heated up in Israel, that Israel's a lot higher up in the pecking order than Ukraine is. And so we're diverting our weapons and money to Israel, and Ukraine's going to wind up being left twisting in the wind. And there's a lot of Ukrainians that are going to rue the day that they started trusting the West as having their back.
Yeah, that's for sure. Well, Father, I really appreciate this. We went through a lot of information there. I'm sure a lot of people are going to enjoy it, because you're always pleasure to listen to, and I really enjoy talking to you. So I really do appreciate you coming on.
Well, thank you. It was good talking to you.
Do you have anything you want to plug, or anything going on at St. Jonah's you want people to know about?
Well, we're working on building a new church on Christmas this last Sunday on the old calendar. We had something like 270 people, according to one count, and we had about 10 cars that pulled in the parking lot and didn't see any place to park and left. And so we bought 2 additional acres, which we haven't been able to develop yet because we're waiting on permits. But we're hoping this year to expand our parking lot and then start building a new church, because we're running out of room.
Well, I'm planning on coming and visiting you soon, and if I can't find a place to park, I might just park like in front of somebody's car or something. I don't know. I'll find
Well, on a
someone.
normal Sunday, I think we still have enough parking, but we continue to see that be an issue, and so we are going to work on fixing that problem.
Well, that's a good problem to have.
Thank you.
All right, Father. Well, I'm gonna stop the recording.